I acted poor and naive at dinner with my boyfriend's rich mom. What she said left everyone speechless. My name is Elena Rivera, and for as long as I can remember, I grew up in a home where silence was safer than speaking, and invisibility felt easier than trying to be seen. I was 5 when my mother died, and not long after, my father remarried. My stepmother moved in with her perfect hair, perfect posture, and her daughter Aubrey. People used to tell us we looked alike. They were wrong. Aubrey had the kind of beauty that made adults smile and strangers compliment her in grocery stores. I was the other one, the quiet shadow trailing behind her. My stepmother never said it directly, but her eyes always did. One of you is worth investing in. The other, not so much. My father did not even bother to hide it. Aubrey was his son. I was the lamp in the corner that only mattered when the power went out. I learned early that children don't need words to understand where they stand. They see it in birthday gifts, in the tone adults use, in the way praise is distributed like currency. Aubrey got new dresses every season, soft velvet for winter, airy lace for spring. I got hand-me-downs from cousins I barely knew, clothes that smelled like attic dust and clung to me as if reminding me they'd been loved by someone else first. Every morning, I watched my stepmother brush Aubrey's hair with patience and tenderness, then turn to me with a clipped, obligatory, "You're fine," even when my ponytail was slightly crooked and my shirt had a missing button. At dinner, if Aubrey got an A-, it was celebrated like a national holiday. If I got an A, my father's response was always the same, a shrug, a sigh, then, "Try harder next time. Your sister didn't have it easy, you know." It's stubbing mine. But the moment that settled deepest inside me, the one that shaped the way I carried myself, the way I viewed my place in the world, came when I was 13. I had spent weeks working on a school design project, a dress made from scrap fabric, sewn by hand, crooked but full of hope. I showed it to my father, expecting the smallest compliment, just 1 ounce of pride. He barely looked at it. Instead, he tilted his head toward Aubrey, who was twirling in her new store-bought dress, pink and glittering like something out of a children's catalog. And then, almost casually, in that flat, dismissive tone I grew to fear, he said the sentence that would echo in my mind for the next 14 years, "You will never be as successful as your sister. Some people are born to shine, Elena. You're not one of them." Das Modity. I remember standing there, holding my little project with my small hands, feeling something inside me crack, not loudly, but quietly, like a thin branch snapping under snow. I didn't cry. I never cried in front of them again. Instead, I swallowed that sentence whole, like swallowing a stone. Over the years, it sat in me, heavy and unmoving, shaping the way I walked, the way I spoke, the way I learned to lower my expectations of how people would treat me. I stopped asking for new clothes. I stopped raising my hand in class even when I knew the answer. I taught myself to take up as little space as possible, to live neatly, quietly, invisibly. It was easier that way. It hurt less. My stepmother always called me the practical one, but what she really meant was the girl who doesn't bother anyone. I didn't correct her. I let people believe I preferred simplicity, but the truth was that simplicity became my shield. Second-hand clothes weren't just a necessity, they were protection. Nobody expects much from the girl in thrift store jeans and an old backpack. Nobody looks too closely. Nobody sees the tremor in her hands or the hunger in her chest to prove she's worth something. Living simply gave me a strange kind of power, the power to stay underestimated. By the time I turned 17, Aubrey was already the star of every room she entered. She danced, she sang, she had friends whose parents owned restaurants and companies. My father worshipped every breath she took. Meanwhile, I worked part-time after school to buy my own notebooks, my own shoes, even my own toiletries. "It builds character," he said once. When I asked why Aubrey's needs were always met, while mine were always negotiable. "Besides, she has potential. You're different." Different. That was the word he used when he didn't want to say less. And evertaligant. The older I got, the more I realized I was living in the wrong place, the wrong life, the wrong role. I didn't belong in a house where love came with conditions and validation was rationed like something scarce. And so I developed a habit, a survival tactic. Whenever something good happened to me, I hid it. If I got a high score on a test, I folded the paper and tucked it into a drawer. If a teacher praised me, I pretended it embarrassed me. If someone complimented my talent, I changed the subject. Hiding became natural. Achievements felt dangerous, like they could attract criticism instead of praise. I grew up believing that anything I did, no matter how good, would always be compared to Aubrey, and I would always lose. So I learned to love the background. I learned to perfect the art of being unnoticed. I learned to blend in with white walls and quiet hallways. And slowly, without fully understanding it, I started shaping my identity around one vow. If I ever succeed, I will never give anyone the power to take it from me. I'll build something quietly, something no one will see coming, and I will protect it by staying invisible. I didn't know then how literal that vow would become. I didn't know that one day I would build a brand worth millions, that wealthy women would line up to buy my designs, that my work would walk down runways I wasn't even invited to. I didn't know I would create something so powerful that people like my stepmother and women like Vivian Hartman would worship it without ever knowing the quiet girl behind it. But I knew this much even back then. I wanted a life where nobody could look at me the way my father had. I wanted success that didn't need anyone's approval. And above all, I wanted to be free from their voices, their judgments, their limitations. I didn't want applause. I didn't want recognition. I just wanted a life where no one could tell me, ever again, that I would never be enough. And so, without realizing it, the path of invisibility I inherited from childhood would become the armor I carried into adulthood, the armor that would one day protect me when the world finally learned who I really was and what I was capable of building from absolutely nothing. By the time I turned 19, the house I had grown up in no longer felt like a home, it felt like a place I was merely tolerated in. Arguments had become a constant hum, like static in the background of every day. My father said I was too emotional. My stepmother said I was ungrateful. Aubrey, in her soft, practiced voice, the voice that always melted adults, said I made everything dramatic. But the truth was simpler. I had become too old to be invisible, and invisibility was the role my family preferred me in. So when the final argument happened over something small, ridiculous, forgettable, it was barely a surprise when my father pointed at the door and said, "If you don't like how things are, you can leave. We're done trying with you." I packed my life into one duffel bag, a few thrifted outfits, a sketchbook, a pair of scissors, and a sewing kit that had once belonged to my grandmother, the only person who had ever told me I had talent. It took me less than 10 minutes to leave the house, but it took me years to shed the heaviness of knowing I hadn't been worth fighting for. I walked out without a plan, without a safety net, without anyone checking to see if I had somewhere to sleep. I remember the night air biting at my cheeks as I stood outside, alone, the reality sinking in. I had no home, no family, no one waiting for me. But for the first time, I also had something I had never truly owned: my life. I took a bus to Denver because it was the farthest I could get with the little cash I had saved from part-time jobs. The city felt big and indifferent, full of strangers rushing to places I couldn't imagine belonging to. But anonymity suited me. In a city where no one knew my name, I wasn't the lesser sister. I was just a girl starting over. Within a week, I found a tiny room in a shared apartment, noisy walls, peeling paint, but mine. And I found a job as a barista, the kind where you memorize orders, smile just enough, and hope customers tip generously so you can afford groceries. I worked overtime whenever possible, but Denver was expensive, and survival required more than coffee making. So I took a second job as a store assistant in a small boutique, steaming clothes in the back room while listening to customers judge fabric quality with casual arrogance. The job paid little, but it came with something I considered priceless: access to discarded materials. Customers often returned damaged pieces, frayed edges, fabric scraps, things the boutique tossed without hesitation. I asked if I could keep them. No one cared enough to say no. Those scraps became my treasure. Late at night, after both jobs, I sat on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by fabric in mismatched colors. I cut, stitched, unstitched, redesigned. My fingers blistered, then calloused. I wasn't fast, and I wasn't polished, but I was relentless. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sewing to impress anyone, I was sewing to breathe. The more I worked with fabric, the more I felt I was piecing together the parts of myself that had been torn apart over years of being told I wasn't enough. Then one evening, while experimenting with the thick strap of a damaged leather jacket and the lining of an abandoned handbag, I created something that felt different. A small structured bag with an asymmetrical silhouette, a blend of soft and sharp lines. Minimalistic, but expressive. A bag that looked like someone had designed it with intent, not someone playing with scraps on an apartment floor. I stitched the initials E.R.V. 1 on the inside, Elena Rivera version 01. I didn't know it then, but that bag would become the quiet seed of everything I would build in the years ahead. Word spread slowly at first. A coworker asked me to make a custom tote, then a friend of hers wanted one. A stranger stopped me on the street, asking where my bag was from. I started taking small freelance design requests to keep up with rent, never charging much. Afraid the moment I asked for real value, people would stop wanting my work. But they didn't. Orders grew. And soon, the demand became something I could no longer ignore, even as I continued juggling 3 jobs. At 23, everything changed. A private investment fund reached out, one I'd never heard of. They said they had seen my designs on social media, posted by a stylist who had unknowingly featured my custom bag in a photo shoot. They wanted to fund a small luxury line. They wanted me to become a real designer. Not a freelancer, not a girl stitching bags on her floor. A brand. The meeting felt unreal. I showed up in thrifted jeans and a clean blouse I had ironed 4 times, hands trembling under the table. They showed me projections, sample materials, a 5-year plan. They asked me what I wanted to name the brand. I hesitated, then said quietly, Rivera Atelier. My name. The one I used to hate, the one my father dismissed, the one I was finally reclaiming. But when they suggested making me the public founder, my stomach tightened. I thought of my father, of Aubrey, of every person who had ever told me I would never be enough. I thought of how exposure had always been dangerous for me, how visibility had always been a doorway for judgment. And so, with a mixture of fear and clarity, I said I wanted to remain anonymous. They were confused, but I insisted. If I was going to build something great, I wanted it to rise without anyone knowing I existed behind it. I wanted my work to be untainted by my past. The company was registered under a trust. A name that wasn't mine stood on every legal document. Rivera Atelier had a faceless founder. I took the lowest visible title possible, assistant creative director, the kind of role no one questions, no one interviews, no one scrutinizes. I wore plain clothes to the office. I blended into the background, and from the shadows, I built an empire. Within 18 months, Rivera Atelier exploded across California, Texas, and New York. Celebrities carried the E.R.V. 1 bag without knowing the initials meant anything. Women queued for limited releases. Fashion magazines called the founder mysterious, strategic, a genius recluse. I watched all of it from behind the scenes. Invisible, anonymous, untouchable. For the first time in my life, being unseen wasn't a burden, it was my power. And I intended to protect it, because the world finally appreciated my work, even if it didn't know my name. And that was enough. Or at least, I thought it was. Success, even when lived in the shadows, can be strangely lonely. Rivera Atelier grew, expanded, flourished, yet I remained the same girl who measured her worth quietly, privately. Afraid that stepping into the light would undo everything I had built. Most days, my life was a cycle of sketches, fabrics, late-night revisions, and early morning production calls. Efficient, disciplined, purposeful, but painfully solitary. So when Michael Hartman walked into my life, it felt like an unexpected softness, a warmth I had forgotten I was allowed to feel. We met in the simplest way, which, in hindsight, feels poetic. I stopped by a small tech repair shop in Denver to fix my glitching phone. He was at the counter that day, sleeves rolled up, hair messy in a way that looked unintentional but endearing. He had the kind of face that made you feel instantly at ease, not because he was particularly handsome in a striking, cinematic way, but because there was gentleness in how he looked at people, a quiet curiosity without judgment. When he asked what had happened to my phone, I admitted I had dropped it while balancing fabric rolls on my shoulder. Instead of laughing or teasing, he smiled softly and said, "That sounds like someone who works really hard." It's Sav. No one had ever said something like that to me, not with sincerity, not with admiration. I felt a warmth bloom in my chest, unfamiliar but welcome. Over the next hour, while he repaired my phone, we talked about small things: coffee, music, Denver weather. He told me he was a software engineer who preferred working with small startups instead of big, flashy corporations. "I like simple things," he said. "And simple people. Not in a boring way, just honest." I remember that word lingering in the air. Honest. It felt like sunlight on parts of me I usually kept hidden. From then on, we saw each other more, first as acquaintances, then as something more tender. He lived in a small apartment with mismatched furniture and plants he forgot to water. He cooked simple meals, worked late, and rode an old bike everywhere. He never boasted, never tried to impress anyone, and that lack of performance drew me in more than any charming gesture could have. With Michael, there were no games, no status, no comparison, just ease. And he loved my simplicity too. He told me often, "You're refreshing, Elena. You're not like people who try to prove anything." He believed I was a design assistant at a mid-level fashion company. He believed I lived in a modest apartment because I liked quiet life, not because anonymity was the armor that kept my real identity safe. He never once questioned my thrifted clothing, my understated lifestyle, or why I avoided expensive restaurants. In his eyes, my lack of luxury wasn't a flaw, it was a virtue. For a while, I let myself enjoy that. I let myself enjoy him. But secrets, no matter how carefully, kept always cast a shadow. And mine grew heavier every time he complimented my humble lifestyle. Every time he called me grounded. Every time he said it was comforting to be with someone unaffected by wealth. He meant it as praise. To him, it was part of why he was falling in love. But to me, it was a reminder that my truth was something that could change everything between us. We lasted almost 8 months before the conversation about his family came up. We were sitting in his apartment, eating takeout noodles, when he mentioned his mother for the first time. He laughed at something on his phone and said, "She'd lose her mind if she knew I was eating out of these containers." Our dish came. I smiled. "She sounds particular? That's one word for it." He chuckled. "She's obsessed with luxury. Designer bags, designer shoes, designer everything." Then he added, almost proudly, "Her favorite brand? Rivera Atelier. Hands down. She has an entire room just for the bags." My fork nearly slipped from my fingers. Michael didn't notice, he was still scrolling. "She keeps telling everyone that the founder must be some mystery genius. She sends emails to the brand every month begging for early access to new releases." He shook his head, amused. "It's ridiculous." I tried to speak, but my voice felt tight. "Does she judge people based on that kind of thing?" He shrugged, still casual. "She does. A lot. She believes wealth says everything about a person's upbringing, potential, values. But don't worry." He reached across the table and took my hand. "She'll like you. Because you're genuine. And she'll see that." Ari Donming, A8. But he didn't know the truth that his mother worshipped a brand I created, a brand she used as a measuring stick to judge women like me, women who wore thrift store dresses and scuffed shoes. He didn't know that the bags she displayed like trophies were designed in the dark by someone she would look down on without a second thought. He didn't know that his mother's worldview was woven from the same prejudice and entitlement I had spent my life escaping. When Michael squeezed my hand and smiled at me, I felt a pang of fear, a sharp, sudden ache in the chest. Because for the first time since meeting him, I realized something. This love, this soft, hopeful, gentle thing was built on the belief that I was someone else. Someone simpler. Someone poorer. Someone whose worth came from the absence of wealth. Someone safe for him to love. And the truth of who I really was felt like a storm gathering on the horizon, waiting for the moment it would break us open. The invitation came on a Wednesday evening, tucked between casual conversation and the warmth of Michael's hand resting on my knee as we watched a documentary on his couch. We weren't talking about anything serious, just laughing, debating trivial details on the screen when his phone buzzed with a message. He glanced at it, smiled faintly, and then turned to me with a softness that made my stomach twist. "Mom wants to meet you," he said, as if announcing something simple, harmless. But the air shifted instantly, the room felt smaller. My breath felt tighter. Vivian Hartman. The name alone carried weight. The woman who curated her identity with couture labels and designer heels. The woman who judged strangers by the structure of their handbags. The woman whose collection of Rivera Atelier bags could fill a gallery wall. Bags she loved, worshipped even, without knowing the quiet girl behind them. I had seen pictures of her before, posted by Michael's sister, a tall woman with perfectly styled hair, pearl earrings, and an expression sharpened by years of looking down on people. She was elegance in a cold, curated form. And now she wanted to meet me. Michael must have sensed my hesitation because he squeezed my hand gently. "Don't overthink it," he said. "She's a little intense, but once she sees how genuine you are, she'll love you. Just be yourself." Be myself. The words sounded simple on his tongue, but to me they felt like walking into a room with two versions of myself, the Elena he believed I was, and the Elena I had worked so hard to keep hidden. The woman who lived modestly, yes, but also the woman who owned the very brand his mother adored. The woman his mother would hate if she thought I didn't belong in her world, but might worship if she knew my name was stitched into every Rivera Atelier creation. Except I didn't want to be worshipped. I didn't want to be despised. I just wanted to be seen as a person, not a status symbol, not a threat, not a mistake. Still, I nodded. "Okay," I whispered. "I'll meet her." The days leading up to the visit felt like an emotional tightrope. Michael was excited in a calm, understated way. He talked about the dinner casually, as if it were just another small milestone in our relationship. And maybe it should have been. But for me, every passing hour sharpened an anxiety I had tried to outrun my whole life, the fear of being judged, dismissed, measured, and found lacking. A fear inherited from every comment my father ever made, every glance my stepmother ever gave me, every comparison to Aubrey that carved itself into my bones. On the morning of the visit, Michael texted me, "Don't stress. Just wear whatever makes you comfortable." That single sentence lingered in my mind. Wear whatever makes you comfortable. Did comfort mean honesty? Did it mean armor? Did it mean letting Vivian see exactly what she expected, a girl with no wealth, no pedigree, no brand name identity, a girl she could underestimate without hesitation? Part of me wanted to dress differently, to wear something that hinted at the truth. Not a Rivera piece that would have been reckless, but something that showed I wasn't as fragile as she might assume. Yet another part of me, the part shaped by years of invisibility, the part that refused to be defined by luxury, wanted to test her. To see who she was without the filter of status. To see how she treated someone she believed had nothing. In the end, that part won. I opened my small closet, sifted through simple blouses and worn sweaters, and pulled out the $20 thrift store dress I had worn on one of my early dates with Michael. Soft navy fabric, slightly faded, with a tiny rip near the hem that I had sewn shut myself. The dress didn't flatter me in any extraordinary way, but it felt honest. It felt like the version of myself Michael had fallen in love with. And it felt like the perfect lens through which to see Vivian clearly. As I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, adjusting the straps, brushing my hair into something neat but understated, I felt a familiar sensation, like bracing myself for impact. I dabbed on the barest amount of makeup, slipped into simple flats, and grabbed my old canvas bag. Not a designer piece. Not leather. Nothing that could be misinterpreted as trying too hard. When Michael arrived to pick me up, he paused for half a second, just long enough for me to fear he saw something wrong, but then he smiled, that warm, steady smile that always made me feel safe. "You look beautiful," he said. "You always do." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Thank you." The drive to his mother's house took about 30 minutes, winding through increasingly affluent neighborhoods. I watched the scenery transform from small-town charm to manicured lawns and stone entry mansions. With every mile, the knot in my stomach tightened. Beautiful houses line the streets, places where people like me were usually staff, not guests. Michael kept talking stories from work, little anecdotes about growing up with his mom, but I drifted in and out of the conversation, my mind circling a single question. If Michael knew the truth about me, about the company, about the wealth I never showed, would he still look at me the same way? I wasn't worried about him loving me less for being successful. I was worried he had fallen in love with the wrong version of me, the quiet girl who blended in, the one who lived simply out of choice and habit, not necessity. Michael admired my humility, but would he understand that it wasn't humility? That it was trauma dressed calmly? When we pulled into the driveway, a long, immaculate path lined with trimmed hedges and stone lanterns, my palms began to sweat. Michael reached over, took my hand again, and said, "She'll like you. Trust me, daughter Ivor." But as the front door swung open and Vivian Hartman appeared with her tailored ivory coat, her sculpted hair, her eyes already scanning me like a critic evaluating a museum piece, I knew instantly that trust was about to be tested. And somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, "She won't like you, not like this." And maybe that's exactly what you need to see. The door opened before Michael could even reach for the bell. Vivian Hartman stood framed in the doorway like a portrait, tall, poised, sculpted perfection from her pearl earrings down to her pristine heels. For a brief moment, the late afternoon light behind her cast a golden glow around her, giving her the majesty of someone who lived her life believing the world existed in her orbit. Then her gaze fell on me. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't polite. Her eyes traveled from my face to my shoulders, then down the length of my $20 thrift store dress, then lower to my worn flats. Her lips parted not in greeting, but in shock so thinly veiled that it felt like a slap. Michael stepped forward, smiling warmly. "Mom, this is Elena." It was dated, and IRAs. But before he could say more, before I could even manage a polite hello, she tilted her head, blinked once slowly, and said the sentence that would sit in my memory like a bruise that never fully faded. "Michael, you brought a girl who looks like she picks through charity shops into my home?" Time didn't stop, but my chest did. The cruelty wasn't loud. It wasn't delivered with anger. It was delivered casually, carelessly, like she was commenting on the weather. That made it worse. That meant she believed it. That meant it wasn't meant to hurt, but simply to state what she thought was obvious. Michael's smile collapsed instantly. "Mom, what? That's not." Vivian lifted a hand, silencing him as if she had every right to. Then she turned to me, offering a stiff, icy smile that never reached her eyes. "You'll have to forgive my bluntness, dear. I just didn't expect." Her gaze drifted over me again, slower this time, as if memorizing every inexpensive detail. There's. I forced a small nod. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Hartman." She stepped aside with a dramatic pause, as though deciding whether to let me inside her immaculate home was an act of charity in itself. "Well," she said, "come in." The interior was exactly what I imagined: white marble floors, gold-framed mirrors, tall ceilings, everything curated to perfection. The kind of place where people like me, dressed like me, were probably mistaken for staff. Vivian led us toward the living room, her heels tapping with sharp precision against the marble, each step sounding like judgment. We had barely taken our seats when she began her interrogation. "So, Elena," she started, crossing her legs elegantly, "where did you get your bag?" She pointed at my canvas tote, plain, practical, not designer. "Not anywhere near designer. It's just something I picked up a long time ago," I said softly. "From where?" she pressed. "A thrift bin?" Michael stared at her, horrified. "Mom." She ignored him. She was looking at me the way someone examines a knockoff handbag, searching for flaws, proof of inferiority. "And your dress?" she continued. "Who designed it?" "No one famous," I replied. She gave a small, satisfied smile, as if she'd won some invisible argument. "Well, at least you're honest." She didn't mean it as a compliment. She meant, "At least you're not pretending to be more than you are." Then came her barrage of tests. "What brands do you usually wear? Do you know who designed the Hartman Gala centerpiece last year? What car do you drive? What restaurants do you usually go to?" Have you ever attended a Fashion Week event? Every question felt like a needle sharp, deliberate, aimed at exposing poverty she assumed I should be ashamed of. I answered calmly, politely, carefully. But inside, a familiar ache grew, an ache from years of being compared to Aubrey, years of wearing secondhand clothes, years of hearing people question my worth before they knew anything about me. Vivian looked unconvinced by every answer, like I was failing some unspoken entrance exam. At one point, she leaned forward slightly and said, "You know, Michael is used to a certain lifestyle. Dating someone who doesn't understand that can be difficult. It's so possible docking ends." "I understand more than you think," I said gently. She gave a short, cold laugh. "Sweetheart, understanding isn't the same as belonging." My throat tightened, but I stayed quiet. I could feel Michael's hand inching toward mine, attempting to comfort me silently, but even his presence couldn't soften the sting of her words. And then she delivered the final blow. Vivian crossed her arms, narrowed her eyes with a mixture of pity and superiority, and said slowly, clearly, deliberately, "Being poor is a choice. And you've made some very poor choices." The room went silent. My ears rang. My chest felt hollow. Her words weren't just cruel, they were familiar, echoing the same dismissiveness my father once used, the same tone that convinced me, for years, that I was destined to be less than everyone around me. I felt 19 again, standing in front of my father with a duffel bag, hearing him tell me I wasn't worth keeping. Michael stood up abruptly. "Mom, that's enough." But she didn't flinch. "I'm only being honest," she said. "Someone needs to be. You think love is enough to bridge decades of difference? It's naive. This woman can't offer you the life you deserve." I swallowed hard. Every instinct told me to defend myself, to tell her everything she assumed was wrong, that the clothes didn't define me, that I wasn't who she thought. But what would that prove? She hadn't judged me because she thought I was weak. She judged me because she saw me as beneath her. Status wouldn't change her. Wealth wouldn't change her. Even the truth wouldn't change her. So I did the only thing I had learned to do growing up in a house that never made room for me. I stayed quiet. But inside, something devastating happened. Something small and soft inside me cracked open, releasing a pain I thought I had buried long ago. A pain that reminded me exactly why I had built my life in the shadows. A pain that whispered, "You were right to hide. People like her will never see your worth." I sat there quietly, holding myself together with every ounce of strength I had left, knowing that this moment, this cruel, humiliating encounter would become the turning point of everything that followed. Dinner was served in a dining room that looked more like a museum than a place where people actually ate. The long mahogany table gleamed under a chandelier so bright it reflected off every polished surface. Silverware was arranged with military precision. Even the chairs seemed more decorative than functional, the kind meant to impress guests rather than comfort them. Vivian led us inside with the posture of royalty escorting peasants. Her expression hadn't softened since the moment I stepped through her door. If anything, the disdain had settled deeper, like she'd confirmed every stereotype she assumed about me. "Before we eat," she said, gesturing grandly toward the far wall, "I want to show you my pride and joy." "It's show!" I followed her gaze, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Displayed across several glass shelves was a collection of Rivera Atelier bags. My bags. The very pieces I had designed in my tiny apartment, sleepless nights stitching patterns until my fingers throbbed. There was the dust clutch, the one with the asymmetrical metal trim I had reworked 8 times. The Avenue tote, a favorite among stylists in New York. The E.R.V. one, the first prototype. The design that started everything. Except this one was the luxury version, the version that had been mass-produced after the prototype sold out in minutes. There were at least 20 bags. Maybe more. Easily over $200,000 worth of my work. My heart lodged in my throat. Seeing them displayed here in the home of a woman who despised the person I appeared to be felt surreal and bitterly ironic. I wondered if she had any idea how many hours I had poured into each design. How many times I had doubted myself. How many childhood wounds had been stitched into the seams. Vivian's voice cut through my thoughts. Aren't they stunning? She said, beaming with pride, not for the craft, but for the status they brought her. I fought tooth and nail to get some of these releases. The brand is incredibly exclusive. Only a very elite clientele is given priority. Michael looked impressed. Mom, this is a lot more than I thought you had. She laughed softly. Oh, darling, I have connections. And refined taste. Then her attention shifted back to me, sharp and assessing. Do you know anything about designer brands, Elena? My throat tightened. A little, I said carefully. She waved a dismissive hand. Well, I don't expect you to understand craftsmanship at this level. Rivera is in a class of its own. The founder, whoever they are, must be a visionary. A genius. Someone with impeccable upbringing, education, refinement. Last is our. She paused, then let her gaze drag over me with open disdain. Certainly not a woman like you. The words landed with a thud in my chest. Heavy. Brutal. Perfectly targeted. Michael's head snapped toward her. Mom, Jesus, what is wrong with you tonight? His shock was genuine, his cheeks flushed with anger. But Vivienne only shrugged, as if stating a simple truth. I'm being realistic. There are levels in society, Michael. Your girlfriend. She looked at me again, her expression tightening. Belongs to a very different one. I forced a faint, steady smile. It's fine. It wasn't. But years of practice made the lie effortless. I had learned to hide pain behind silence, to swallow humiliation before it reached my eyes, to let insults settle quietly without letting them crack my voice. Inside, though, something shifted, something raw and deeply familiar. This was the same feeling I had sitting at my father's dinner table, hearing him praise Aubrey while barely acknowledging me. The same burning humiliation I felt when he told me I would never amount to anything, the same ache of being judged before being known. I thought I had outrun those ghosts. Built a new life. Created something powerful enough to shield me from people like him. People like her. But sitting there, staring at a wall of my own creations she worshipped while dismissing me, I realized something painful. I was still terrified of being seen as less. Still terrified of being measured and found unworthy. Still terrified of being that girl again, the one who didn't belong. Michael reached for my hand under the table. I'm sorry, he whispered, eyes apologizing in a way his mother never would. She's not usually like this. But she was. And we both knew it. Vivienne continued admiring her collection as if no emotional wreckage sat behind her. Do you know what the waitlist for these bags is like? She asked no one in particular. People practically beg to be added. Some women cry when they're denied. Rivera Atelier is the pinnacle of luxury. It's untouchable. I looked at my bags, and felt something twist painfully in my chest. Untouchable. Elusive. Reserved only for the wealthy, the admired, the privileged. And here she was telling me I didn't belong in the presence of creations she adored. She had no idea how close she was to the truth, and how far she was from understanding me. Michael finally stood up. Mom, enough. You're being cruel. Vivienne blinked, genuinely surprised by his tone. I'm being honest. You may not like it, but honesty is kinder in the long run. Then she looked at me one last time, cold and clinical. A woman like you will only hold him back. Pain rushed up my throat, sharp and suffocating. But I swallowed it down as I had done my whole life. I gave her a quiet, brittle smile, not because she deserved it, but because breaking down in front of her would have felt like giving her exactly what she wanted. Inside, though, a truth settled heavily into my bones. The reason her words hurt wasn't because I believed them, but because some part of me still feared they were true. Some part of me was still that girl standing in my father's living room, hearing that I wasn't enough. Some part of me still lived with the instinct to make myself smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. And that part wounded. Wary. Deeply afraid now stood face to face with the most brutal version of the prejudice I had spent my entire life trying to escape. Dinner went on, but the air in the room had changed. The chandelier still glowed brightly overhead, the silverware still gleamed, the perfectly plated food still sat untouched before us, but the atmosphere had curdled into something brittle and icy. Every sound felt sharp. Every second stretched too long. And every breath I took hurt. Vivienne, however, seemed perfectly at ease. She sipped her wine with practiced elegance, her expression composed, confident, utterly convinced she held the moral high ground. The cruelty she had inflicted in the last hour hadn't softened her mood, it had satisfied her. In her world, she had simply done her duty, protecting her son from someone unworthy. The final blow came casually, almost lazily, as if she were discussing the weather. She set her wineglass down, folded her napkin neatly, then turned to Michael and said, "You need to end this relationship." Michael's fork clattered loudly against his plate. "Excuse me?" Vivienne didn't blink. "I'm not asking, darling. I'm telling you. This girl," her chin tilted toward me with surgical disdain, "will not fit into our lives. Into your life. Into this family. You deserve someone who understands your world. Someone with class. Someone who won't embarrass you." Something inside my chest twisted painfully. My fingers, which had been trembling under the table, curled into a fist. But Vivienne wasn't finished. "Break up with her," she said. "Tonight." "I have no," he said. "Buys." Michael stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped harshly against the floor. "Mom. That's not happening." "What the hell are you talking about?" "I'm talking about your future," she replied calmly. "And about the mistake you're making. I will not watch you waste your life with a woman who has nothing to offer you." I felt the air leave my lungs, not because her words were true, but because I had once been a girl who believed them, a girl who was told she wasn't enough. A girl who had been pushed out of her own home for being the least valued person in it. And now, here I was again, hearing the same old verdict in a different voice. Michael moved closer to me, placing a protective hand on my shoulder. "Elena is the best thing that's happened to me. She's kind, smart, hardworking. She's poor," Vivienne snapped. "She has no refinement, no background, no stability. She will drag you down. And if you stay with her, you will resent her for it later." Down our faces, there it was. The verdict. Delivered like destiny. I felt a pressure build inside me, slow at first, then rising, sharp and unstoppable. Not anger, not fear. Something deeper. A realization, a clarity I hadn't had before. All my life, I had swallowed cruel words, quieted my voice to survive, shrunk myself to avoid conflict. But something in me had changed the moment I saw my own creations displayed proudly in the home of someone who despised me. Something inside me had finally had enough. I stood up. Michael looked startled. Vivienne looked mildly amused, as if she expected I might cry or flee. Instead, I looked her directly in the eyes, steady, unblinking, and said, "You don't have to accept me. And I don't need your acceptance." The room fell silent. Utterly, shockingly silent. Vivienne stared at me, her expression flickering for the first time, not with respect, but with confusion, like she couldn't comprehend that someone like me had dared to speak back. Michael whispered, "Elena." But I kept my gaze locked on his mother. My voice was calm, but I could feel the years behind it, the years of being underestimated, dismissed, unworthy in the eyes of people who believed they had the right to judge me. "You don't know anything about me," I said softly. "You haven't asked. You haven't listened. You looked at my clothes, my shoes, my bag, and decided everything about who I am and what I'm worth. That says more about you than it does about me." Arded way. Vivienne's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. Michael reached for my hand. "Elena, wait. Let's just get through tonight." "No." I shook my head gently. "I can't stay here." His eyes softened with worry. "Please. We can talk about this. She'll calm down." I gave a sad smile. "Michael. She doesn't have to calm down. This is who she is. And I can't shrink myself anymore just to make other people comfortable." I wrecked. A silence fell between us, a silence heavy with fear, love, regret, and something neither of us could define yet. I stepped back from him, and the gesture alone felt like something inside me tearing. Then I turned toward the front door. The house was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the thermostat. My footsteps echoed softly down the marble hallway. When I reached the entryway, I grabbed my old canvas bag and opened the door. A rush of cold air hit my face. Snow was falling light, quiet flakes drifting down like memories. And in that moment, I was 19 again, standing on the porch of my father's house with a duffel bag and the knowledge that no one wanted me. Except this time was different. This time, I wasn't being pushed out. I was choosing to leave. Choosing myself. Michael hurried after me. "Elena, please wait. Don't walk out like this." I turned to him. His eyes were pleading, panicked, desperate to fix something he didn't break. I wanted to reach for him. I wanted him to reach for me harder. But he could not in the way I needed. Not against his mother. Not against a lifetime of her expectations. "This isn't about you," I whispered. "And I'm not angry. I just can't let myself stay in places that hurt me anymore." He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. I stepped outside. The snow caught in my hair, on my eyelashes, melting against my skin like tiny drops of cold truth. Behind me, Vivian stood at the end of the hallway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She said nothing. She didn't have to. As the door closed behind me, I felt the weight of her house, her world fall away, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel small. I felt free. I barely slept that night. Not because I regretted leaving Michael's house, but because the weight of everything, the humiliation, the childhood echoes, the tension of choosing myself pulled at every corner of my mind. Yet beneath the exhaustion was a strange, steady calm. A sense of inevitability. Tomorrow was a day I had been preparing for silently, unknowingly, for years. Rivera Atelier was hosting its annual VIP Winter Showcase in Aspen, a private, high-profile event attended by elite clients, investors, celebrities, and industry giants. Normally, I stayed in the background, watching from behind frost glass walls or remote surveillance screens, letting the trust-appointed executives take credit for public appearances. But this year, the board insisted I attend. We had hit milestones no one expected: record sales, global expansion, and iconic status in under 5 years. And they wanted the founder me to step forward for once. I agreed only because the event was structured enough to protect my anonymity until the reveal. No one outside a small circle knew the truth. Not even most of the company's staff. It was carefully orchestrated. Still, that morning in Aspen, as I stepped into a tailored black gown, a Rivera Atelier piece I had designed months ago, but never worn, I felt the weight of the moment, not anxiety, not fear, but a strange, powerful alignment, as if the universe had finally arranged everything into one inevitable confrontation. The event hall was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung from wooden beams, massive windows framed snow-covered pines, and guests floated through the room in couture pieces that cost more than my first year of rent in Denver. They mingled with champagne flutes in hand, conversations mixing languages, accents, and worlds. As I arrived, quietly slipping into a back entrance with the help of security, the head of public relations clasped my hands in excitement. "Tonight is your night, Elena. This industry is about to meet the woman behind everything." I just nodded, my heart steady. If last night had taught me anything, it was that stepping into my own identity didn't need to be terrifying. It needed to be mine. The ceremony began as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Guests took their seats. A soft orchestral score filled the room. The host stepped on stage to thunderous applause and began announcing awards. I stayed in the shadows backstage, listening quietly. Then I heard her voice. Vivienne. She was in the front row, laughing, chatting, bragging. I peeked through the velvet curtain, and there she was, dressed in a jeweled white gown, hair perfectly curled, surrounded by her equally polished friends. On her lap sat a Rivera bag, a limited edition piece only a handful of clients owned. She stroked it like a prized possession. Of course she would be here. Vivienne attended every Rivera VIP event religiously. It was her sanctuary, her place of worship. But seeing her now, so confident, so sure of her place in this world, while still believing I was beneath her, beneath all of this, was something I wasn't prepared for. Michael sat beside her, looking drained, his expression tight and distracted. He kept checking the entrance, scanning the crowd, searching for me. My breath caught. He didn't know I would be here. He didn't know tonight would shatter every assumption he had about me. He didn't know the truth he had been loving in the dark was about to step into the brightest spotlight imaginable. The host's voice boomed through the room. And now, our final honor of the evening. The award for the most influential woman in fashion this year. Applause erupted. The winner, the host continued, is the visionary behind Rivera Atelier, the mind responsible for redefining American luxury and global design. Vivienne straightened eagerly. Finally, she whispered loudly enough for everyone around her to hear. "We'll see who she is." She didn't know how right she was. The host smiled at the audience, milking the suspense. "Ladies and gentlemen, please stand and welcome the founder and owner of Rivera Atelier." I closed my eyes. Took one steady breath. Miss Elena Rivera. The world froze. For half a second, it was silent. Not a gasp. Not a movement, just pure, stunned stillness. Then every head turned toward the stage. Every head. Every face. Every pair of eyes. Michael's breath visibly caught. He stood halfway, then stopped, as if his body didn't know how to react. His face drained of color, shock widening his eyes. And Vivienne shot up from her chair so fast her $12,000 purse slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a loud crack. She didn't even look at it. Her face twisted with disbelief, horror, confusion, like her world had tilted and dropped her somewhere she didn't recognize. "No," she whispered. "No, no, that's not." But it was. I stepped onto the stage. The spotlights hit me warm, bright, blinding. Applause erupted. People stood. Cameras flashed. For the first time, the world saw me. Not as a designer's assistant. Not as a quiet girl in secondhand clothes. Not as someone who didn't belong. But as the creator of the very world Vivienne worshipped. My heart was pounding, but my face remained calm. I had worn invisibility like armor for years tonight. I let myself take it off. "Thank you," I said into the microphone, looking out across the sea of stunned faces. My gaze found Michael's. His expression held everything at once: shock, hurt, awe, confusion, love. Then my eyes shifted to Vivienne. She looked like she had been struck. Her mouth trembled, her hands shaking slightly. She couldn't reconcile the woman she had belittled with the woman standing on stage, celebrated by the elite she admired. For the first time in her life, Vivienne Hartman had misjudged someone so completely that it shattered her entire worldview. And I stood there, steady, unapologetic, finally whole. The applause was still echoing in my ears long after the ceremony ended. People continued stopping me for photos, handshakes, congratulations. But their words felt distant, barely brushing the surface of my consciousness. My mind was still anchored to two faces in the crowd: Michael's stunned disbelief and Vivienne's collapsing composure. Once the lights dimmed and the cameras were packed away, I slipped out through a quiet hallway toward the private lounge reserved for honorees. It was dimly lit, warm, quiet, the opposite of the cinematic chaos I had just stepped out of. I just needed a moment to breathe, to collect myself, to let my heartbeat settle back into something manageable. But I didn't get that moment. The door opened behind me. Abruptly, forcefully. When I turned, Vivienne stood there. Her mascara smudged, her lipstick faded, her breath uneven. She looked nothing like the perfectly constructed woman I had seen mere hours ago. For the first time, since meeting her, she looked human. And frightened. "Elena," she whispered. I stayed still. Saying nothing was easier than deciding how much of myself I was willing to give her. She closed the door behind her and took a shaky breath. "I didn't know. I didn't know who you were." "Yes," I said quietly. "You made that very clear." The words hit her harder than I expected. She winced, stepping closer but stopping herself as if crossing the room required permission she no longer felt entitled to ask for. "I'm sorry," she said. The words came out strangled, almost painful. I was wrong. About everything." She wiped at her cheek, her voice trembling. "I thought you were going to hurt my son." I thought you would make his life harder. I thought her voice cracked completely. I thought he deserved better. My jaw tightened. Better? I repeated softly. Or richer, better. Or someone who fit your picture of what worthy looks like. Vivian dropped her gaze, shame staining her expression. I was scared, she admitted. Not of you, of losing influence. Of losing the life I built for my family. I wanted someone who would elevate him, not someone I believed would hold him back. The honesty, though flawed, wasn't the problem. The problem was the part she didn't say. It was never about me being poor, I said, my voice steady but edged with a truth I could no longer hide. It was about you deciding I was less refined, less valuable, less human, even. Her mouth trembled. Elena, you looked at my clothes and assumed the rest. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't care. You just saw someone beneath you and decided that was enough information. Vivian sagged into a chair, looking more broken than I imagined she could ever appear. For a woman who had built her entire identity on status, the humiliation of being exposed of having judged the wrong person must have been unbearable. I should have treated you with kindness, she said quietly. I didn't, and I'm sorry, truly. I believed she meant it. Regret had softened her features in a way nothing else ever had. But sincerity didn't erase harm. It didn't change the fact that she would have continued treating me like dirt if she hadn't found out the truth. The truth didn't humble her. Being wrong did. I appreciate the apology, I said. But the wound is still there. You judged me before you knew anything about me. She nodded slowly, accepting the consequences. I understand if you'll never forgive me. I didn't answer. Forgiveness wasn't something I could consider tonight. Before either of us could speak again, the door opened a second time. Michael. He froze when he saw the two of us, breath catching as if he'd run across the entire lodge. His eyes went straight to mine, relief, pain, confusion, all tangled together. Elena, he said softly, stepping toward me. I've been looking everywhere for you. My heart trembled. I hadn't prepared myself for this part. Facing Vivian was one thing, clean, necessary, unavoidable. Facing Michael, our hurt. He moved closer, stopping just a foot away. I didn't know, he whispered. About any of it. About who you are. What you built. You never told me. I know, I said. I would have listened, he continued, voice cracking. I would have understood. That was the part that broke me. Because he believed it, truly, and maybe he would have tried. But trying wasn't the same as standing up for someone. Rivera Atelier was hosting its annual VIP Winter Showcase in Aspen, a private, high-profile event attended by elite clients, investors, celebrities, and industry giants. Normally, I stayed in the background, watching from behind frosted glass walls or remote surveillance screens, letting the trust-appointed executives take credit for public appearances. But this year, the board insisted I attend. It's our kind of, isn't it? 9. He flinched. I hated hurting him, but the truth had waited too long already. I need something different, I said. I need someone who stands with me not because of who I am, but because I am theirs. Because they choose me. Not because I fit. Not because I reveal myself. But because they believe in me. His shoulders slumped. I do believe in you. But not loudly, I said, voice barely above breath. And I need loud. Trying wasn't enough to erase the way he let his mother speak to me for months, the way he asked me to stay calm when I was humiliated, the way he wanted us to get through the night instead of drawing a boundary. I love you, he said, more desperate now. I didn't know how cruel she could be. I swear, if I had seen it sooner. That's not the point, I whispered. You shouldn't have needed to see her treat me that way to defend me. You should have stood by me because you loved me. It still takes, or dumbly tender. We stood there, two people who loved each other, separated by invisible wounds we couldn't heal for each other. He took a step closer. Please don't go. We can fix this. I shook my head slowly. Michael, I've spent my whole life trying to earn people's approval. My father's. My stepmother's. Yours, your mother's. Tonight I realized something. I don't need to earn anything. Not anymore. His eyes filled with tears. So that's it? I swallowed hard. I'm choosing myself this time. Leaving Aspen that night felt like stepping out of an old skin. Not a triumphant escape, not a dramatic rebirth, just a quiet shedding of something that had weighed on me for far too long. The drive back to Boulder wound through dark mountain roads, snowfall softening every curve, every shadow. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about survival or expectations or the versions of myself I had built to fit inside the world of other people. It still takes, or dumbly tender. We stood there, two people who loved each other, separated by invisible wounds we couldn't heal for each other. He took a step closer. Please don't go. We can fix this. I shook my head slowly. Michael, I've spent my whole life trying to earn people's approval. My father's. My stepmother's. Yours, your mother's. Tonight I realized something. I don't need to earn anything. Not anymore. His eyes filled with tears. So that's it? I swallowed hard. I'm choosing myself this time. For a woman who had built her entire identity on status, the humiliation of being exposed of having judged the wrong person must have been unbearable. I should have treated you with kindness, she said quietly. I didn't, and I'm sorry, truly. I believed she meant it. Regret had softened her features in a way nothing else ever had. But sincerity didn't erase harm. It didn't change the fact that she would have continued treating me like dirt if she hadn't found out the truth. Not about pain, either. Just about being alive. Being here. Being me. In the early spring, I planted lavender around the edges of the cabin. Rows and rows of it. I knelt in the soil, letting the earth crumble between my fingers, breathing in its damp scent. Lavender had always meant calm to me, gentleness, healing, soft strength. Watching the small plants take root felt like watching pieces of myself begin to settle after years of turbulence. But healing didn't come from silence alone. There were wounds I had carried since childhood, wounds that hadn't healed just because I had become successful, wealthy, accomplished. Those wounds whispered to me in the quiet moments. The voice of my father telling me I'd never be enough, the silence of my stepmother letting that cruelty shape me. The shadow of Aubrey's effortless perfection swallowing any space I tried to claim. And the humiliation at Vivian's dinner table, triggering every old bruise I thought I had outgrown. So I found a therapist in Boulder, a woman in her 50s with gentle eyes and the calm presence of someone who had seen thousands of stories and still believed each one mattered. In our first session, I told her that my success confused me. That I didn't know how to hold it without feeling like I was betraying some old version of myself. That I still felt small around people who reminded me of my father. That someone's disapproval could still cave something in my chest. She didn't tell me I was wrong. She didn't tell me I should be grateful, or strong, or past it. She just nodded and said, "Pain that starts in childhood rarely disappears on its own. It waits for us to be ready." I cried for the first time in years. Week by week, I learned to unravel the tangled grief I had pushed down for so long. I learned that trauma doesn't always shout, it whispers. It whispers that you have to work harder than everyone else. It whispers that being invisible is safer. It whispers that love must be earned through perfection or silence. And I learned, slowly, painfully, that those whispers weren't truth. They were scars. One afternoon, months into therapy, I found myself sitting across from my therapist, staring at the floor when a quiet understanding settled over me, simple, grounding, undeniable. I didn't have to prove anything to anyone. Not anymore. Not ever again. The moment was small, but it was the hinge everything turned on. For the first time, the worth I carried didn't come from the company I built, the recognition I received, or the love I lost. It came from the steady, quiet knowledge that I was enough just by being here. As I healed, Rivera Atelier evolved with me. The board had long admired my community vision, and with the company's expanding influence, we finally launched something I had been dreaming of since the early days, a mentorship and support center for young women who felt unseen, ignored, or underestimated by their families. Girls who had been told they weren't enough. Girls who had been pushed aside for a sibling. Girls who believed their dreams were too big for the lives they were born into. I want to share something with you, not a name, not a detail, not a person. I won't give power to the ones who hurt me by putting them at the center of my story. A gentle murmur swept the room. But I will say this, the people who underestimate you will always be loud. Until they're not. Soft laughter bubbled through the audience, painful, knowing, healing. I used to believe my worth was decided by how others saw me. Whether they praised me or dismissed me, accepted me or rejected me. The public founder of Rivera Atelier, that polished persona the world now recognized, existed only on rare occasions. In the center, I was not the founder. I wasn't a CEO. I wasn't a face on a magazine cover. I was just Elena, the woman who made tea for visiting students, who offered gentle advice from the corner of the room, who helped a shy girl thread her first needle, who listened when someone whispered. My dad said I'll never be anything. I knew that pain. I knew that voice. And now I could help someone else quiet it. The cabin in Boulder became my sanctuary, the mentorship center became my purpose, and the quiet within me after years of noise finally became a home of its own. Healing wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic, it was slow, patient, and tender. But day by day, I felt myself returning stronger, softer, complete. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't living in response to someone else's judgment. I was living for myself. 1 year passed quietly, almost softly, as if life itself knew I needed gentleness after years of noise. The lavender I planted around the cabin had grown into full, fragrant bushes. Every morning, they swayed in the breeze like small purple waves, and every night they perfumed the cool Colorado air. My days were no longer split by urgency or fear, but shaped by intention therapy sessions. Design meetings conducted from a place of confidence rather than survival. Afternoons spent mentoring girls who reminded me of younger versions of myself. By the time winter rolled around again, I felt like I had become someone new, not because I reinvented my life, but because I finally stepped into the one I should have always had. Then came the invitation. Women of Colorado Annual Summit, honoring leaders, innovators, and changemakers. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I wanted another spotlight, another stage, another moment where the world pressed close enough to see through me. But this event wasn't about luxury or prestige. It wasn't about fashion or wealth. It was about resilience. About women who had built something powerful not because they were born into privilege, but because they had carved their paths from the sharp edges of adversity. So I said yes. The summit was held at a modern glass venue overlooking a frozen lake in Denver. Snow blanketed the surrounding pines, and warm golden lights shimmered through the windows, giving the entire building a gentle, radiant glow. Inside, women of all ages mingled: entrepreneurs, activists, artists, executives, survivors. This room wasn't about ego, it was about community. As I arrived, people greeted me warmly. Some recognized me from the Aspen reveal, but most knew me because of the mentorship center Rivera Atelier launched that year. They thanked me, hugged me, told me what the programs had done for their daughters, their students, their communities. For the first time, admiration didn't make me shrink. It didn't make me uncomfortable. It simply felt right. Earned, rooted. I was set to give the closing address, the final speech of the evening. Before I went backstage, I glanced around the room. That's when I saw him. Michael. He stood near the back, half hidden behind a row of chairs. His coat dusted with snow, his hands in his pockets. He didn't approach. He didn't wave. He didn't try to draw my attention. He simply watched quietly, respectfully, with a softness in his eyes that made my breath catch. Time hadn't changed the way he looked at me. We opened the first center in Denver, a modern, warm building filled with sewing machines, design studios, therapy rooms, and quiet corners for journaling. The program offered creative workshops, funding for education, emotional support, and, above all, a place where these girls could see themselves reflected in others who had survived similar wounds. I didn't appear in photos or give speeches. As I walked onto the stage, the lights felt softer than the Aspen spotlights. Not blinding, not demanding, just present, guiding. I took my place at the podium, looking out at hundreds of women whose faces blended into a tapestry of hope and strength. I didn't prepare a script. I didn't need one. I placed my hands lightly on the podium, breathed in the lavender scent still clinging faintly to my clothes, and began. A year ago, I stood on a very different stage. The board had long admired my community vision, and with the company's expanding influence, we finally launched something I had been dreaming of since the early days: a mentorship and support center for young women who felt unseen, ignored, or underestimated by their families. Girls who had been told they weren't enough. Girls who had been pushed aside for a sibling. Girls who believed their dreams were too big for the lives they were born into. Success built on secrecy is lonely. And worth built on someone else's approval isn't worth it all. I paused, letting the truth settle. It took me years to realize that my value was never supposed to come from those who looked down on me, or from those who couldn't see past my clothes or my silence. My value was always mine to define. Somewhere in the back, I saw Michael close his eyes, maybe in regret, maybe in understanding. I want to share something with you, not a name, not a detail, not a person. I won't give power to the ones who hurt me by putting them at the center of my story. A gentle murmur swept the room. But I will say this: the people who underestimate you will always be loud. Until they're not. Soft laughter bubbled through the audience, painful, knowing, healing. I used to believe my worth was decided by how others saw me. Whether they praised me or dismissed me, accepted me or rejected me. Thanks for watching. My voice softened as I reached the part that had lived inside me for years. Asterisk, asterisk. But now I know. A woman's true value isn't shaped by who looks down on her, but by how she learns to look at herself. Silence. Pure, absolute silence. Then a rising wave of applause, deeper and more emotional than anything I had heard before. I stepped back from the podium, feeling something I had never fully felt: not pride, not closure, but peace. Real, quiet peace. Not about pain, either. Just about being alive. Being here. Being me. In the early spring, I planted lavender around the edges of the cabin. Rows and rows of it. I knelt in the soil, letting the earth crumble between my fingers, breathing in its damp scent. Lavender had always meant calm to me: gentleness, healing, soft strength. Watching the small plants take root felt like watching pieces of myself begin to settle after years of turbulence. But healing didn't come from silence alone. I wasn't the girl in the $20 thrift store dress, shaking as she stepped into the cold. I wasn't the young woman searching for validation. I wasn't someone living in the shadows of other people's opinions. I was Elena Rivera. A woman who survived. A woman who built herself. A woman who learned that freedom comes from choosing yourself, even when it costs everything. I glanced once more through the window. Success built on secrecy is lonely. And worth built on someone else's approval isn't worth it all. I paused, letting the truth settle. It took me years to realize that my value was never supposed to come from those who looked down on me, or from those who couldn't see past my clothes or my silence. My value was always mine to define. Somewhere in the back, I saw Michael close his eyes, maybe in regret, maybe in understanding. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't cold. I wasn't afraid. I was free.